So in the last video, I gave you an overview of the rationale for these programs where we're passing the cost of processing on to the consumer. And I mentioned that there's two primary forms or structures that this takes in our industry. The one we're going to talk about in this video is surcharging. So I just want to, again, give you kind of an overview. What is surcharging? How does it work? What are the benefits? And also, what are kind of some of the cons? So you have your pros and cons list here. So with surcharging, the way it works is very, very simple. So explaining it is very easy. And that's actually one of the good things about surcharging. One of the things that has going for it is that it's very, very easy to explain. It's very straightforward. What happens is simply this. With a surcharge program, excuse me, when a consumer comes up to the register, there is going to be a sign posted usually at the front door and at the register or on the homepage of the website and the shopping cart. So there's going to be these signs posted that are basically going to say, hey, if you use your credit card, then you're going to have an additional fee added on. It's usually not going to say the word surcharge. It'll usually say service fee or something else. But the idea is if you use your credit card, we're going to add on to it, right? So it might be 3.5%, might be 3.99%. There is a rule about surcharging that it cannot be above 4%. So 4% is the ceiling on surcharging. Anywhere below that is acceptable. But of course, you want to make sure you're able to generate a profit from the account. So with surcharging, the terminal is going to recognize if it's a credit card. Now, the biggest disadvantage of surcharging is that you cannot add a surcharge to a debit card transaction. Now, let me clarify this because this is where it gets a little bit confusing. A lot of people misunderstand because of the language on a lot of terminals. They misunderstand what a debit transaction is. So many times people think, well, if I enter my PIN number, that's a debit transaction. Right? But if I sign for it, or if I use my chip card and I put it in there and I don't put my PIN number in and it's my bank card, that's not a debit transaction. The truth is, a debit transaction is very simply a transaction that uses a debit card. That's it. Okay? So you have credit cards and you have debit cards. What's the difference? Well, I think we all instinctively know this, but let's clarify it just to make sure we're on the same page. A debit card means you have a card that is directly tied to a bank account or savings account where you have money, okay? So you're not borrowing money when you use your debit card. It's a card tied to your bank account, right? And so you're just swiping the card, and the issuing bank that issued you the card is simply taking money that you already have in their bank, and they're sending it over to another bank. So in those cases, usually in many cases, the cost of acceptance for those types of transactions is going to be a little bit lower, okay? So a few years ago, something came out called the Durbin Amendment, and the Durbin Amendment regulated the cost of interchange fees for these debit cards about 85% of the time. And so the way this regulation worked is that large banks that have over $10 billion in assets, which is most of the banks out there today have over $10 billion in assets. These are your larger banks. They all got regulated with their debit card interchange to 22 cents and 5 basis points. Now, we've talked a lot about these numbers in other training courses, so I'm not going to dive into too much more detail here. But that cost basically means that if somebody has an average ticket of over $30 or so, it's generally going to be a lot less expensive for them to accept a debit card than a credit card. All right. If they have an average ticket of below, let's say $10, now it's going to become significantly more expensive to accept debit cards. So it can be a little frustrating there. But the idea with surcharging is that because overall, when you look at the big picture, overall, it is cheaper for businesses to accept debit cards. Visa and MasterCard came out with rules that basically said, hey, we're going to allow a business owner to surcharge. That's fine. But they can only surcharge credit cards, okay? So let's zoom out a little bit, pros and cons, and then we're going to move on to cash discounting, which is a little more complex to explain. So with surcharging, again, it's very simple. We're adding a fee onto credit card transactions, but importantly, not to debit card and even prepaid cards. We're not allowed by the Visa rules. We're not allowed to add a surcharge to debit or prepaid cards. We can only add it to credit cards. That means the terminal that's installed has to recognize a credit card versus a debit card and only add the fee to the credit card transaction. Okay? So a compliant surcharge program is going to include some signage. Pretty simple. But where the complexity comes in with the surcharge program is actually the technology. You got to have a technology that recognizes the credit card versus the debit card and then adds that fee only when it is a credit card transaction, not when it is a debit card or a prepaid card. Now, these programs are great. They do create a lot of margin because you are charging usually a little bit of a higher rate on those credit card transactions. But the other big con to it is, keep in mind, the business owner is going to have to pay the fees on the debit transactions. So you're passing the cost of processing onto the consumer for the most expensive transactions, usually, which is the credit card transactions, which is great. But you're not passing the cost on, because you're not allowed to pass the cost on, for the debit and the prepaid cards, which for many businesses is 40, 50, even 60% of the transactions. So for a lot of the transactions, even though it's a lower cost per transaction, it's still a lot of transactions, and the business owner is going to have to pay fees for that. So the pros for surcharging: easy to explain. It is 100% compliant with Visa rules. There's no question marks. Everybody knows exactly what you can do. There are certain states where you're not allowed to surcharge yet, but I'm not going to dive into that in this part of the course. But as long as your state allows surcharging, it's very straightforward. It's very easy to explain, and it's very easy to implement. The downside is that you cannot pass the cost of processing on for the debit transaction, so the business owner still has to pay those expenses, which is why you're normally going to save a merchant somewhere between 40 to 80% of whatever they're paying in processing. If they're paying $1,000 a month and they switch to surcharging, they're probably still going to pay somewhere between $200 to maybe even as much as $600 instead of $1,000. So they're going to save a lot of money, but they're not going to wipe out all their processing fees because they still have to pay for those debit transactions. Okay, so those are the pros and cons for surcharging. Now let's talk about cash discounting and other programs that are similar to it that approach this in a very different way.